City, here in New York City. I teach at St. John's University. Historians, we have, just like what you are doing in your classes, as you know, history has a long period of time. And so it also, every country has a history. Every profession has a history. Institutions have histories. People have histories. So what I do as a historian is I study Latin America, particularly Mexico and the border region between Mexico and the United States. So that means I had to learn a number of languages, languages that are part of Mexican culture. So obviously I speak fluent Spanish, but I also read and work in French and Italian and Portuguese. I also have a little bit of knowledge of some indigenous languages in Mexico too, because I teach them. So I had to learn pronunciation that would be, say, how to pronounce Aztec, or the more formal term Mexica terms, and maybe you have studied the Aztecs. So we historians, we learn lots of languages, in part so we can read the documents that are left behind by people who lived in the past. So this takes a long period of time. It's a lot of studying, but it's worth it, because then we do things such as research projects, and we write books, and we write articles. We talk to third grade classes in Pennsylvania. We also may work in documentary film. How many of you watch the History Channel? Anyone? Oh, great. Okay. And so historians work at the History Channel, and they work with documentary filmmakers as advisors. Sometimes not, but frequently documentary filmmakers will ask historians to ensure that what they're making a movie about is in fact accurate, historically accurate. So that's kind of a little bit of what I do, but I also teach history, and then I'm also chair of my department, which means I organize the events for not only students and faculty, but also within my institution.
So we heard, if I could just paraphrase a little bit, you said that you have to do a lot of reading and you look at documents from the past, okay? And we did talk a little bit on Monday, just a little bit about primary sources. So I'm wondering if those documents that you look at were actually from that time period that you were studying? Okay.
Yes, so primary sources are materials, documents, evidence that are produced in the moment. All of you are producing primary evidence. Your report card is a primary document. If you're a financial transaction, so say when you go with your mom and dad to the grocery store or something and they buy something, what is produced at that moment is a primary document. Historians years later, if they wanted to do an economic analysis of grocery shopping in 2015 in a particular part of the United States, they may want to cull that data.
Okay.
So we are always producing evidence, primary evidence. So what historians do is we go and seek out that primary evidence. So for instance, I wrote a book on student protest in 1968 Mexico. What did that mean? That meant I read a lot of student newspapers. I did not look at student report cards, though. I looked at student newspapers, but I also looked at student drawings and their posters that they made. So all of these were actually kept in an archive. Now, most of the evidence that we create over our lifetime, the primary evidence, disappears. Mm-hmm. How do you think it disappears?
Well, how do you think it disappears? So, for example, one of the kiddos made this for me, okay, an origami ninja star. So that's a primary source. Pinwheel, I'm sorry.
That's primary evidence, source. Yes.
Okay. So why do you think primary sources kind of go away after a while? That's what she's asking. Why don't we always have a whole bunch of them? Do you want to try to answer that? come on over. You can answer. Come on, Nick. Okay. Just let her know who you are and tell her what you think. Why do you think they disappear?
My name's Nicholas, and I think they disappear because it's like a matter of time. I mean, you don't do it for your whole life or something.
Right. So sometimes they disappear over time. It could even be sometimes the quality of the paper might disintegrate because so for instance, some of the materials I worked with, the paper was so delicate, it would literally fall apart as I was holding it. So what archivists try and do is, in fact, you don't touch the paper because it's so delicate.
Okay.
So you're right. It can actually literally just deteriorate over time.
Yeah, because I'm a Cub Scout, and I went to, think it was an old house. I forget what it's called, in downtown, and we weren't allowed to touch anything because it was so old.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It can, the oils in your fingertips, even if you wash your hands, can actually deteriorate certain things that are very delicate, such as certain types of material, fabric, and paper. So that's why we don't frequently touch the paper.
Okay. Anything else? You know what I heard? We had some teachers that were talking just the other day about their parents who kept stuff. So we were talking how their parents had kept all of their old report cards, and guess what these teachers did? They just threw them away.
Right.
So those primary sources that their parents had kept for years and years and years are gone.
Right. That's what frequently happens. Now, I'm not advocating that everybody become a hoarder. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that over time, that's what happens. A lot of material disappears. So and also there has to be places to put it. So libraries and archives, that is where a lot of that material is housed.
Okay.
So whenever you go into a library or an archive, whatever you see in a historical site, even in a historical house, whatever you see in a museum, a library, or a historical site is just really the tip of the iceberg of actually what is available for the historian in that historic location.
Okay.
So we lose a lot of things, but we also have a lot of things. So that's kind of part of what we're going through as historians, trying to figure out where materials are located, but also maybe what has disappeared over time.
So I do have a question for you. If we decide to, as detectives, that we decide to talk to our family members who are here, and they tell us something that happened a long time ago, maybe when we were babies, that would still be a primary source if they were there, right?
Right. So what we call are these, say if you wanted to go and talk to your mom and dad or your grandparents about a particular event in the past, maybe around the time you were born or even before you were born, what that is called is an oral history. And it is asking somebody about the past from their perspective. So everybody will have a different perspective of a particular event in the past. And we as historians, we collect those. And in that process, we also try and understand, such as who is the person? Where are they coming from? So for instance, what's going on around the time and the place where they live? Because a perspective on a historical event in your hometown might be very different of a perspective of a historical event where I live.
Okay.
So you always think about kind of the time and the place and the person, their community, all of these things you also put into that oral interview. And you would even kind of tag that interview with some citational information. So the person who's going to be the interview, you would ask that person, will you introduce yourself? Will you briefly say where you live? And also the topic that we're talking about. And you would actually record that.
Okay. So even if we know them, even if it's our grandma, we should do that because we are documenting history. Even though you know it's your grandma, we should still have them say that whenever we go to find information out.
Right, because
Okay.
any historical work that you're working on, you want to ensure that somebody who comes back to look at it can recreate it.
Okay.
In a few steps. So your grandma, you know your grandma. I know my grandma.
Uh-huh.
But if I'm interviewing my grandmother or my grandfather, I do. So I have interviewed my grandfather. My grandfather is one of my grandfathers is still alive. He's in his 90s. And he has also been interviewed for the Smithsonian because he was in World War II and had been in Asia prior to Pearl Harbor.
Oh, wow.
So he has this very long memory of action in the Pacific. But in that process of being interviewed, even though I know this story, he will in fact give that information at the beginning. My name is such and such. I was born on such and such date, and I was on such and such ship during World War II.
Okay.
And so that's how to start. Because if someone wants to use that interview, then they immediately have that information at the beginning. And they'll say, oh, yes, I'm writing on ships. I'm writing on World War II and the Pacific Arena and the sea battles. This is an interview I want to listen to. And so they know immediately to pay attention to that one.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I also have another question. When you're talking, you said something about the person's perspective or point of view. So I'm wondering if maybe we did something and we asked a parent about it, and maybe we have an older sibling. Would it be helpful to get their perspective because they might see it a little bit differently? Is that a good idea, or does that not matter?
Yes. So perspective differs according to a person's age. It will differ according to where they are in the moment. Perspective may differ depending upon what is the theme. If they are an adult versus a child perspective, and you want to capture that. So you might have a very different perception of an event that happened in your hometown that maybe, say, a parade or something, especially if you marched in the parade. Say one of you mentioned you were a Cub Scout. So if you're in the parade and you're marching in the parade, you actually have a different perspective of the parade if you're in it than if you're your parent and your parent is observing the parade from an audience position. So perspective helps, and it can literally be who's where at the time of the event and why.
Okay, that's good to know. And I'm even thinking, like, we have some really solid examples of that. For example, I have a couple of kids who play football, and if they're playing football, you too, they might be having a great time, but it could be 30 degrees and raining, and your parents might be thinking something a little bit different. They might love that you're playing, they want to see you, but it might be kind of miserable because it's cold and rainy.
Because it's cold and rainy, and they're standing on the sideline rather than running up and down and keeping warm.
Yep. So,
right.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Now, Nicholas had a question. Do you still have that question, or was it answered? Do you have one? Come on.
My mom always says that. I don't really. When it's cold and we have our football games, sometimes I don't need to wear long stuff because he says that I'll be running and I'll keep warm.
Yep, you will keep warm. Connor does have a question for you.
It's not a question, but my nan and pap have everything from when my dad was a kid to now.
Okay, so you said that your nan and pap have a lot of primary source documents about your dad. Okay. Nicholas, did you have a question?
Well, I remember where I was. It wasn't the Pearl Harbor. It was the Plow Tavern. Tavern in downtown New York.
There are some historical sites where we live, and he went and visited one.
Right, because you live in a very historical place. Yeah.
Before we go, do you have any advice for us as we start digging around in history? We know to look at perspective, right?
Right. Look at perspective. You also look at complexity.
What does that mean?
So something that, sometimes we think, well, that a particular event was because of just one reason. And frequently there are multiple reasons. And so you want to pay attention not only to the reasons, but you also want to understand the time and the place. So for instance, the experience of, say, World War II would be very different in, say, New York City versus other cities or a small town. And so because of just some of those changes, one is that it's New York City is along the coast. It's a port city. It's also where a lot of people actually left to go to Europe to fight in the war. So you had a lot of fluidity. So you want to think about place. You want to think about time. You want to think about the people in the area. And that leads to the complexity. So how does a war impact somebody or a historical event in a particular place at a particular time? And it'll be different if it's in a rural area or if it's in a city, if it's in a suburb. All of those things you want to keep in mind. The other thing you want to think about is when you're looking at materials, you also want to, as historians, we study change over time. So we think a lot about that. So how are things changing over a period? Your city has changed over time. So how was it, say, in the 1800s versus in the 1950s versus presently? So you want to keep those things in mind, especially when you're talking to your parents and your grandparents, because they have memories of a very different place in a different time. And you want to pay attention to those things. The other thing we do is we always source a document. So even when, remember I told you about having somebody introduce their interview?
Yes.
You want to think about that. You want to source the document. So whether it's an oral interview or it's a photo or it's a document, you want to, where did you get it from? Why is it significant? If it's a photo, definitely who's in the photo? What time was it taken? If you know who took the photo, so say for instance you're interviewing your grandmother and you're going to use a photo. Did your grandfather take the photo?
Okay.
Did your mom or dad take the photo?
Okay.
All of those things are really important, and it's about sourcing the document.
Okay.
And again, it's so if anyone comes back to look at your research, they can easily trace it back. They can figure out what you did and what you were thinking.
Okay.
So it's about being completely open.
Okay, we could definitely do that. Now, did
Yes.
you still have a question, sir? Or was it answered? Come on over if you do.
Hi, my name is.
Hi.
My name is Saxon. I was wondering if historians look for clues.
We look for a lot of clues. So in my most recent book, I write on crime. And I actually found a clue where there was a reference of a woman criminal in the 1960s, and they mentioned her quote-unquote notorious criminal grandmother. That was just one word, well, two words, notorious and grandmother.
Uh-huh.
2 words in one document. And that was the clue. It just it was like gnawing at me. Why would her grandmother be referenced? And what does it mean when they say notorious? So what did I find? Her grandmother was a criminal mastermind of organized crime in Texas. So again, it took me about 5 years. I'm not advocating this for all of your projects, but 5 years to piece that together.
Wow.
Because I just found one clue. And that clue was like a hunch, detectives, real detectives. And I work a lot with police officers here in NYPD, and they'll talk about a hunch.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a hunch.
Okay.
And so it took me a long time to kind of piece together the whole family history, but it came from that one clue.
So that's called persistence. We talked about persistence.
Historians are persistent,
yes.
And we have to be patient.
So you look for clues, you're persistent, you cite evidence. They do kind of solve mysteries because sometimes, well, why don't you come over here, buddy? Okay, want to tell her who you are and what your question is, but you have to talk loud.
Hi, my name is Aiden.
Hi.
Do historians solve mysteries?
Yes, we do. We solve mysteries. Sometimes they're historical mysteries. So, for instance, sometimes a historian, will be in an archive or a library and find some major documents that change our perspective about the past. Sometimes historians will work with attorneys on particular issues to almost like being a detective in that, because attorneys are also working with police officers, and this may not have to do with crime. It can do with things like land grants. Who owns the land ultimately? And that can be a mystery, especially if people are fighting with each other about land ownership. And sometimes historians are brought in to figure that out, or who has rights to the water on the land, or those types of things. Who has rights to access the land? And historians frequently figure out those mysteries, and it can take a really long time. And sometimes it can be quite quick.
Do you have time for just one more question?
Yes.
Okay, come on over, buddy.
What is your favorite thing to do as a historian?
What part of it?
That's a good one. My favorite thing to do as a historian is to go to an archive in a library. Archivists and librarians are collaborators. They are our co-authors, co-researchers. So what I do is, when I have time, when I'm not busy teaching and doing more kind of work within my institution, I go to a library and I look at documents, and I also use a lot of digitized materials too.
Okay.
So that's one of my favorite things to do. It's when I get a chance, that's what I do, and that's how I write my books and my articles. So it's a real joy. So it does mean you have to like to read and read a lot. But it also is having that question. Remember, we talked about a hunch that you're trying to follow, a mystery you want to solve. That's what you're doing. You're just doing it through paper or material culture or images or something like that. So that's my favorite thing to do as a historian.
If you remember, Connor said his Nan and Pap had a lot of stuff from his dad when he was little, so his Nan and Pap could be considered an archivist. Not professional archivist, but for their son, they were archivists. Now, I have a totally unrelated question, only because I'm not sure if searches will go here, but if they had an event that maybe a family member posted on Facebook, and they go back to look at that, would that be a primary source?
So this is really interesting, because now with historical events, and I'll give you just one example. When a couple years ago, there was a tidal wave that hit Japan, a tsunami. And scholars at Harvard who were experts on Japan were getting tweets and Facebook posts from friends in Japan. So these posts, they're sending them and emails to their friends in the United States. So what they immediately started to do within literally a couple hours of the tsunami is they started archiving all those Facebook and Twitter, the tweets and the emails, and created a digital archive that's minute by minute of what is happening. Your Facebook posts or your tweets are evidence.
Wow.
And what you have to be able to do, though, so say you tweet something, or your mom tweets something about your birthday party, and then it's retweeted by your family members. The thing that happens is that you have to go back to the original tweet. So if you wanted to cite that tweet about, say, or your grandmother's birthday party or a Facebook post, you would go back to the original one. But it is evidence.
Okay, that's good to know. Because I'm just thinking, if they had things that their parents had shared and then they could go back and look, then that might. Catherine, one last question. So
That's a primary document. A tweet or a Facebook posting is a primary document if it's at that moment.
Thank you.
It's a primary document.
Okay, Catherine just has one more question, and I know that you are doing this as a volunteer, so we don't want to take up too much of your time. Go ahead.
What is a tidal wave?
A tidal wave is when there is an earthquake under the ocean. So we know that the plates shift and it creates an earthquake more that's down in the ocean, which then results in a tidal wave, a tsunami. That's what it is. So it's an earthquake which triggers a tsunami.
Dr. Carey, you were amazing. You gave us a lot to think about and go back to. And if it's okay, we use this conversation as an archive. Is it okay if I archive it and keep it for us? Okay. Third grade, I know that we talked about being a good digital citizen. If we're all yelling bye, it's really annoying for the other person on the other end. So we can wave and give her a thumbs up and let her know that we are appreciative. Thank you so much. You made our day.
Thank you for your great questions.
Okay.
And I look forward to hearing about your projects.
We will definitely share with you. Okay, now.
And I'm following your teacher in your class on Twitter.
Okay, thanks. Bye.